A cold winter night in Los Angeles. The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets soaked, the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the slick pavement. The city still shimmered with towering buildings reaching for the sky, but in the hidden corners there were lives slowly fading into obscurity. Hugh Jackman left the film set after a long day. His classic Porsche 911 glided through the wet streets. Leaning back in his seat, he stared ahead, lost in thought. In this world of glitz and glamour, he had never let himself be swept away by the superficial. Hollywood wasn't just red carpets and flashing lights. It was also a harsh reality, where some people struggled every day just to survive. He turned onto a quieter street heading home to rest. But then, something caught his eye. Under the dim glow of an old street lamp, an elderly homeless woman sat curled up on the sidewalk. Her tattered, thin blanket offered little protection from the cold. Her frail hands trembled, clasped together in a feeble attempt to fight the biting chill. Beside her lay a worn-out fabric bag, perhaps everything she owned in this world. A sharp gust of wind blew past, making her let out a weak, pained whimper. Hugh tightened his grip on the steering wheel. How many times had he seen this? Lives forgotten in the shadows of a dazzling city. A familiar sense of helplessness welled up inside him. He could drive away just like everyone else. But this time, he refused to turn a blind eye. He hit the brakes. The car came to a stop by the curb. Without hesitation, he stepped out, pulling his hat lower over his face as he walked toward her. The street was nearly empty. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the soft tapping of water droplets falling from rooftops. As he got closer, he saw the bluish tint on her lips. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He crouched down, his voice calm and gentle. "Are you okay?" The woman lifted her gaze. Her sunken eyes held both surprise and caution, as if she couldn't believe someone was actually talking to her. I. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Without hesitation, Hugh slipped off his thick coat and carefully draped it over her shoulders. "It's freezing out here. You need to stay warm." Her eyes filled with tears. The world had long forgotten her, yet in this moment a stranger had stopped, showing her kindness as if she mattered. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Hugh didn't say anything. He looked around. Cars passed by, neon lights flickered on the wet pavement, but no one else stopped. No one cared. Had indifference become the norm in this world? He lowered his voice. "Have you eaten?" She didn't answer. Her eyes shifted away as if too ashamed to admit the truth. Hugh didn't press further. He stood up, walked back to his car, and reached inside. He pulled out a paper bag, the sandwich he had bought earlier but never ate. Returning to her, he handed it over. "Here, eat this, and then I'll help you find a warm place to stay." Her frail hands shook as she took the bag, carefully unwrapping it before taking a bite. The way she ate, quick, desperate, told him everything. How long had she been starving? Hugh exhaled softly and sat beside her in silence. She didn't say much, but her every movement, every glance spoke volumes. And he knew he couldn't just leave her here. "I'm going to take you somewhere better, okay?" She froze, fear flickering in her eyes. Maybe she had heard too many empty promises before. "Trust me," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." Something in his voice reassured her. It wasn't pity. It was genuine kindness, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She hesitated, uncertainty clouding her face. Then, after a moment of silent struggle, she gave a small, hesitant nod. Hugh gently helped her to her feet, guiding her toward the car. As he opened the door, she hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I won't make your car dirty, will I?" That sentence hit Hugh like a knife to the heart. He crouched down, carefully taking her frail hand in his. "You deserve help, Get in, I'll take care of you. Maggie looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. Then slowly she allowed him to help her into the passenger seat. Hugh shut the door, taking a deep breath. Tonight he wasn't just helping someone, he was changing a life. The Porsche 911 glided down the quiet streets. The streetlights cast faint, flickering reflections on the wet pavement. Inside the car there was only silence. Hugh glanced at her. She sat curled up, gripping the coat he had given her, clutching it tightly as if afraid this moment of kindness might disappear like a dream. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, as if no one had asked her that in a long time. After a moment she whispered, "Margaret, but most people call me Maggie." Hugh smiled softly. "Maggie, that's a beautiful name." She let out a weak chuckle, but in her eyes a deep sadness lingered. "You're the first person to say that in years." Hugh didn't respond, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood. Maggie had lost more than just a home. She had lost the feeling of being seen. "Do you have any family?" he asked. Maggie gazed out the window, her expression distant and empty. "I used to," she murmured. "A small house in the suburbs. A family, but my husband passed away. Then my son—" Her voice broke. Hugh didn't rush her, he waited. "He promised to take care of me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But then, gambling, drinking, it took him away. One day he just disappeared. I searched, I waited, but in the end I had nothing. Just an old woman with nowhere to go." She turned to him, her eyes welling up with tears. Hugh met her gaze, his heart heavy. He couldn't fully understand her pain, but he knew what it was like to feel alone in a loud and indifferent world. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. Maggie shook her head. "It's not your fault, son. Life, it just happens." Silence filled the car once more, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and Maggie's faint sighs. Hugh knew he couldn't let her spend another night on the streets. After a moment of thought, he spoke. "I know a place that can help. A shelter I've worked with before. They'll give you a warm bed, meals, and people who care." Maggie looked at him, fear flickering in her eyes. "But I don't have any money." Hugh chuckled softly. "You don't need money. They help people rebuild their lives, not just survive the night." She went quiet. No one had ever made her an offer like this. For so long, she had been invisible, just another forgotten soul in the city. But now, someone was looking at her, truly seeing her. Tears welled in her eyes as she exhaled shakily. "You're a good man," she whispered. "I've never met anyone like you." Hugh didn't reply. He simply pressed the gas pedal a little harder, steering towards St. Joseph Center, a place he trusted, a place where Maggie would finally find warmth, safety, and maybe a second chance. The modest building stood under the warm glow of its lights. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it offered something far more important: hope. Hugh pulled over, stepped out, and walked around to open the door for Maggie. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. She looked at the shelter, hesitation flickering in her eyes. They'll really help me here." Hugh nodded, his voice steady. "I've met people here. They got a second chance at life. You can too." Maggie held his gaze for a long moment. Doubt and hope battled in her weary eyes. Then, finally, she gave a small nod. Inside, the shelter staff welcomed her with kindness, not pity, but genuine respect. Hugh stood back, watching as Maggie was led into a small room. It wasn't a luxury hotel, but it was something more, a place to start over. She looked around the modest space, her face filled with disbelief. "This is mine?" she whispered. Hugh nodded. "Get some rest. I'll come back tomorrow." Maggie turned to him, and for the first time, tears rolled freely down her face. Thank you. I don't even know what to say. Hugh didn't respond. He simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before quietly stepping away. Out in the hallway, he took a deep breath. Bringing her here was only the first step. A night in the shelter wouldn't change her life. She needed something real, something lasting. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until a familiar name caught his eye. David Carter, an old friend and former social worker who had dedicated his life to helping the homeless. Without hesitation, Hugh called. David, I need your help. A deep voice answered on the other end. Hugh, you don't call at this hour unless it's important. What's going on? Hugh exhaled. I met an elderly homeless woman tonight. I can't let her go back to the streets. She needs something stable, a home or at least a long-term program to help her get back on her feet. There was a pause before David chuckled softly. You never change, do you? Always looking out for someone? Not everyone gets a second chance, David. I want her to have one. Another pause, then a thoughtful hum. I've got some contacts. Let me see what I can do. Send me her info. Hugh nodded. Thanks, man. I owe you one. David laughed. Come on, you helped the whole world. Let me help you this time. Hugh ended the call with a sense of relief. He glanced back at the room where Maggie was settling in. Her journey wasn't over, but at least she had a new beginning. The next morning, when Hugh returned to St. Joseph's Center, Maggie took a long time to answer the door. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You really came back? Hugh smiled. I told you, I'm not leaving you alone in this. Stepping inside, he noticed something unexpected. The room was spotless. Maggie had tidied everything, her bed neatly made, the small table wiped clean. It was as if she wanted to prove that she wasn't just someone in need, but someone who still had value. You didn't have to do all this, he said softly. Maggie looked at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet glimmer of hope. A week later, with David's help, Hugh secured a small apartment for her. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, safe, and most importantly, it was hers. As they drove to her new home, Maggie sat silently beside him, clutching the fabric of her coat. Hope and uncertainty danced in her expression. When they arrived, she nearly stopped breathing. The apartment was simple but welcoming, a cozy bed, a tiny kitchen, a wooden table by the window, where the morning sunlight would spill in each day. Standing in the doorway, Maggie hesitated. Her trembling hand reached out to touch the doorframe, as if making sure it was real. This is really mine? Hugh nodded. From now on, this is your home. She turned to him, eyes brimming with emotion. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Hugh replied with a warm smile. Just live well, be happy. Maggie stepped inside, sitting at the edge of her new bed. Her hands ran over the soft blanket, afraid that if she blinked, it would all disappear. Hugh sat beside her. Do you remember what you used to love doing before all of this? She was quiet for a long time, as if digging through memories she had locked away. I used to love gardening, she whispered. I loved growing flowers, but I haven't had a garden in a long time. Hugh smiled. Then we'll find a way to make you one. Maggie broke down in tears, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of joy. Over time, Maggie adjusted, slowly rediscovering joy in life. One afternoon when Hugh visited, he found her on the balcony carefully tending to small pots of soil. Tiny blossoms had begun to bloom, stretching toward the sunlight. Maggie looked up, her eyes shining with a happiness he had never seen in her before. You gave me a miracle, she said softly. Hugh shook his head, smiling. No, Maggie, you created this miracle. She chuckled, the wrinkles on her face softening into something beautiful. In a quiet corner of a dazzling city, a life once forgotten was now flourishing, like those small, resilient flowers growing strong, reaching for the light.